conversation is that I'm an environmentalist and an entrepreneur, and I co-founded a company called Library of Things nearly 8 years ago in 2014 to tackle wasteful consumerism. And the idea is to make borrowing better than buying. We do that by making it really easy and affordable for people to rent or borrow collections of useful items from DIY tools, sewing machines, sound systems, waffle makers, all sorts, from local spaces in their neighborhood, and then connecting neighbors together to share practical skills in reuse and repair. And we started Library of Things as a fairly traditional nonprofit at the very beginning. We ran that company for 4 years, and we were a group of friends and neighbors, all volunteers, limping from one year to the next with trying to get some grant funding to do what we were doing. But at the same time had demand from communities all around the country and around the world saying, hey, we want a Library of Things. Can we do what you're doing? Can you help us do that? And we didn't feel like we had a viable model at the time. And it was really difficult to grow just on grants. And even though we had quite decent trading income from what we were doing. So we reached a crossroads in that where we thought, to really serve this mission, we need to bring on bigger sources of capital and really fund what we're doing to build our technology, to develop our team and be able to grow and fulfill our mission. And at this point, we met Patrick and we said, we want to do something different because at the moment we have a binary choice. We're either going to become a for-profit company limited by shares, where we heard that funders were looking for kind of 10 times their money back and wanted an aggressive growth story, or we stay as a non-profit and we are stuck in this place that we're in with donations and people that don't want any return on their money, but it's keeping us small. And so Patrick, at that time, helped us explore a new model altogether, which is really about a for-purpose company, and we created Library of Things Limited, which is, in really simple terms, we have the decision-making control with the stewards of the company, so the voting rights are held by the legal directors, and then we have ownership shares, which are separate to that decision-making, they're non-voting, and then we have a guardian share, which is a really hard kind of mission lock on our purpose, especially as we're going through a period of growth and fundraising. We wanted to make sure that we stayed true to our sort of North Star mission, and that keeps us accountable. And so we did that restructure, and over the last 3 years, that's enabled us to raise now a total of 1.5 million in mission-aligned equity investment from 275 individual investors, including a crowd campaign. And we've grown from 1 to 11 neighborhoods in London at the moment. And I suppose that the headline of that was a very difficult journey. And it's not something that we really talked about much until quite recently, because we felt very other and very separate to the world that we're all used to, which is business grows and does kind of bad and harm, and charities mop up the mess. And so basically the reason I'm here is because if we had a story like Patagonia 4 years ago, that journey would have been easier. Because it's a hero story that we would have been able to point to as part of our storytelling. And now it feels like there's a real groundswell in lots of different models like Library of Things, but not just like what we've done, that are really coming to the fore. And it feels like the time is now to put collective focus on it. And so very interested to hear what everyone has to say about it today and the questions that you have.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, as you can hear by that sort of little glimpse there, Library of Things has done something absolutely incredible, and I've got a really interesting story behind it, which we are looking forward to digging into in this session. Patrick, please tell us about yourself.
Yeah, hi. Hi, everyone. So I did a law degree in the 1980s, and I can remember the moment when it was explained to me how land is owned in the UK, and this starting concept that our dearly departed Queen owns all the land. In legal theory, all land above the high water mark is owned by the Crown, and so we're sort of allowed to occupy it, but fundamentally it will in time revert back to the Crown if you die intestate, for example, which blew my mind a bit, and particularly then when that was followed by a sort of an understanding that the same applies to people. that we are subjects of the crown and that we're given some rights, but fundamentally we're sort of owned in legal theory by the crown, which is quite an interesting idea. So I sort of took that law degree, became a corporate lawyer, had worked for some really large companies in-house. I was, so not a proper lawyer, some might say, but had lots of fun and entertainment, and then finding and loved that energy and drive of business, and until it dawned on me around 20 years ago how connected that was with things like climate change and deforestation, which was really starting to get more in the news even 20 years ago. And I couldn't help connect up. My brain started to connect up this relentless drive for growth, almost at any cost, and the harm being done to the environment, and this ownership model where good people found themselves caught up in almost this world, almost without their knowing it, consciously, intentionally, just serving these remote shareholders who we'd never meet. And I just found it all very bizarre when you stop to think about it. And bizarre, no one was talking about it or thinking about it. So I suppose so then I sort of jumped off the corporate ladder, if you like, and have been, in a way, fooling about for 20 years, saying there must be a better way. And I suppose part of my journey has been, I'll keep this short, but I suppose just unraveling ownership means you start to get into questions of, well, it's not just about ownership, it's about governance. And then you have to start getting to management, and you start to unpeel the whole organizational onion of, well, there's sort of the ownership, and then there's governance, and there's management and leadership, and how are those things interlinked? And some people latch onto the leadership, you need better leaders, or the governance, or the ownership, and they're all interconnected is the reality. So anyway, so I've been sort of wrestling, questioning, playing with, and lucky enough to bump into people like Emma over the last few years, and just have a chance to experiment. So hopefully some of that will come up in this conversation. But yeah, needless to say, I'm very, very interested in ownership.
Yeah, to put it mildly, very, very interested. Yeah, I mean, Patrick has been in this space for 20 years. I want to age you, Patrick, but you've had a huge amount of experience and knowledge around all the different ownership structures, and has worked with lots of businesses that you will recognize and might be surprised by the fact that they have actually incorporated some of these structures. But I wanted to first, before we go into the breakout rooms, I wanted to first get Patrick and just set the scene here and unravel this onion, as you said, around actually what has Patagonia done in terms of the structure that they've used, so we're all on the same page, because we had a lot of questions really specifically about that. So I think you're the best person to answer that question.
Okay, so I'll start with the very big picture and drill down to hope it makes sense. And I'll start by reading something. It's obvious indeed that no change of system can avert those causes of social malaise which consist in the egotism, greed, or quarrelsomeness of human nature. What it can do is create an environment in which those are not the qualities which are encouraged. It can establish the social order upon principles to which, if they please, humans can live up and not down. So that was written in 1921, an Oxford professor, R.H. Tawney, and was quoted in the classic book Small is Beautiful, written in 1973, which has a very interesting bit at the back about ownership, by the way, worth reading. It was a business school classic in the 80s, widely read and widely ignored. So I suppose that question of, in a way, how do we organize in a way that brings the best out of humans, rather than bringing out their quarrelsomeness, their destructive competition, their greed and egoism? That's a question which, in a way, is common across cultures and realms and societies and so on in history. And organizations, in a way, are the biggest show in town these days, aren't they? They're more powerful than governments. It's less about who's elected, it's what the markets do. So an ownership, and if you look at an organization, well, the sort of the stuff they do in the middle of the onion, perhaps, the day-to-day activities, whether or not for profit or for profit. Then there's, on the outside, is the ownership piece. And then linking that is maybe the governance, how decisions are made, who makes decisions. So what Patagonia, and as I said, different people pick on different elements and say, it's all about leadership, we need better people, need better systems. What Patagonia have done is latched onto or raised this question of ownership. And what is ownership? In law, it's a bundle of rights that are given to a group of people. And I think what I've been sort of looking for, hoping for, and maybe starting to emerge is a trend that at the moment the dominant model is sort of private ownership of organizations. That's seen to be more efficient, it's the norm. Private ownership of oil companies, of big and small companies, and the sort of the hero's journey that individuals go on to own, found, control, lead, and then sell. And in Gandhi and others have talked about, well, a shift to stewardship. So that's not really ownership anymore. That's a holding of shares, of property, of land, of money on behalf of others. And so that's the essence when people talk about steward ownership, which I would put Patagonia into that category. Now, one question was about employee ownership. So there are sort of stewardship type models where trustees hold shares on behalf of the employees. So John Lewis, the retailer, is held like that. Riverford, who I work with, they have trustees who hold the shares, and the dividend flow and so on is held for the benefit of the employees. So rather than individual employees holding a stake. So from that point of view, what Patagonia has done is not fundamentally different, but what they've done is they've said, we hold for the benefit of the planet. And so there are some technical differences in the way it's structured legally. And I suppose the nuance they've done, it's not uncommon to have, and there's the Purpose Foundation in Germany who's propagating this model of you have a charity which owns a company. I think often people observe, well, actually, charities aren't great owners of businesses. They don't understand business mindset and motivations. So like Bosch, the white goods manufacturer, is owned by a charity, but it's still sort of an extractive ownership. They extract money to give away. And I think whereas some employee ownership tends to be more of a, well, we're all in this together. Where should ownership be held? Where should the decision-making be held? So governance ownership, in a way, two sides of the same coin. And what Patagonia have done is they've said we've got one charity which will take the dividends and spend it on climate change. And they've chosen a form that allows them to campaign politically, because often charities are restricted on how they can engage in politics. But the Patagonia model, they can. So they can campaign and advertise to combat climate change. And then they've set up a sort of a golden share owner who hold all the voting rights, and they oversee the management of the company to make sure it's run efficiently and effectively and so on, but in line with the values. So in a way, they've split up the sort of governance from the ownership. The spare profits go to combat climate change, and then the voting rights are held by trustees. So that's sort of the essence of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I think there's so much there that you reveal that I think is helpful in this conversation, specifically around how do we, the sort of ownership and the governance piece, what exactly it means for Patagonia and what it means for other businesses. And we'll be sort of digging into specifically what more questions come out of that. Feel free to put them in the chat, and we will hound Patrick with his questions in a moment. But first, we are going to go into some breakout rooms, just 5 minutes, just so that you can first of all meet somebody else. We're sort of a rare collection of people, hopefully becoming less rare, who are interested in this topic. So first of all, it's nice to meet somebody else. And second of all, we want to, have an opportunity to discuss what your questions are with somebody else. And hopefully that will bring up some interesting, even more questions as we go into the broader conversation. So I'm going to launch these breakout rooms now. You should be in a group of 2, there'll be 1, 3 as well, and it'll just be 5 minutes. If you just introduce yourself and tell that person your questions and your interest in the topic today, and we will see you in 5 minutes.
Understand where he came And I think that for me, so I've got his book. It's well worth a read, by the way. Let My People Go Surfing, Yvon Chouinard's book. So he never actually acted like a sort of an extractive owner. From the very, very beginning, he was a reluctant businessman, he called himself. So I think for me, the first starting point is, if you're a founder, a business owner, if you take that attitude of, well, I'm stewarding this for the next generation, then you start to make different decisions about who you invite in as your investors, how you structure everything. So I don't know that necessarily, unless someone's there, they've been founding a business 25 years ago, they haven't got outside investors they've got to negotiate with. I think, of course, well, why not do that? Or I think there's a lot of interesting in that. I suppose, and I see Dev Oxley here too. One of the first questions I had about the Patagonia model was, well, why haven't they given any to the employees? Because aren't they, and that's in the steward. So I don't know the governance arrangements below the ownership. How are the employees engaged? I think Patagonia's always aspired to be one of these places where there is more self-management, more autonomy. He's got a lot of stories in his book about that. So, but I think the idea of, but I think what we've done with, in a way, if you start backwards, you're starting a business, who should be the ultimate founder? Who are you trying to serve? Is it remote investors who can then make lots of profits from your efforts, or is it the community? Well, then how can you structure in a way, and how can you work towards a way that the community can own? And is that through you holding power and then giving it away like Yvon Chouinard? Or do you more like Library of Things say, well, we attract investment, but we explain to the investors the deal is you're not going to maximize, because if you maximize, the community can't afford it. So, and they say, well, that's philanthropy. Well, no, it's not philanthropy, and it's not maximization. It's something a bit more nuanced, like donut economics is a new form of economics. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's some of the thoughts that come up to me when I heard that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like one of the key questions is, and I think a lot of people grapple with this, like who are you trying to serve with the business that you're building? Who do you really want to be helping? Who do you think should have the ownership over it? How would you structure your governance? I'd love to hear from Emma about why exactly you chose your particular model here with Library of Things.
Yeah. To be honest, it kind of came from the gut. Like when we started Library of Things, the reason we did it was to solve a problem that we all cared about. So there's three co-founders, and primarily our impact is about making it really affordable and easy for everyone to access things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford or don't actually need to own. It's kind of reimagining ownership on the level of, do you really need the products in your house? And we're serving the community through providing a different alternative to like Amazon. And then this is about, one of my co-founders is really passionate about how you use that to build community in a place. How do you connect people living in the same place, especially in somewhere like London, to each other, to have resilience at the level of community? And I come from an environmental background, and I was thinking, well, single-use products is just a crazy concept, that you would use something twice and throw it away, and that burden shouldn't fall on the individual. It should really be about reimagining how we make products to start with. So the mission has, I guess, always been the propelling force, and as founders, we are keepers of that mission, and that is our job. And I am an entrepreneurial person. I've always loved the idea of playing around with business models, and I'm not doing this for a purely it's not about philanthropy for me. It's about, I believe this should exist in the world, and my job is to create a vehicle that enables this model to grow everywhere it possibly could. And so but we're constrained by the very real reality of legal structures and funding structures, which are age old, and really, to be honest, they're at odds with creating a regenerative kind of business in the way we imagined. And I would say at the point that we restructured and we met Patrick, who then took us on a journey of initially, sort of 6 months to a year, and then ongoing, because it's an ongoing piece of work. It's not something you do once, where we've been, really in the weeds of like legal structures and saying, how do we hack what's already there and work with structures that exist, but make them work for us? And so in a way, I think at that point that we reached the junction 4 years ago, probably there was a bit of naivety in that. Let's create an ideal model that has the best of both worlds. We can take on equity investment, but in a way that we feel is right for us. But what we didn't know at that point was, I don't think I really appreciated, having never gone out to raise investment before, how binary the funding world is. So we had our model that we totally believe in, and I still believe in it, and I want to see it grow, this governance model. But the funding world isn't there yet. And so, yeah, it's pretty exhausting when you're talking to private investors who are used to this venture capital model. And I don't just mean venture capital funds. I mean like an angel investor who just is used to this dragon's den model. I'm going to make loads of money from betting on 10 companies, and one of them is going to become the next Uber. Like, that is so entrenched in our like cultural narrative. Or it's kind of talking to institutions who are really all about impact, but they say, are you serving society's poorest? Because we're about, you know, this really needs to be for the most needy. And we don't live in those worlds. So we're kind of like a non-binary type of organization. And so, yeah, we stick to it and we keep going. But I think what we realize the work we need to do is sharing what we've done, campaigning for easier access to funding for these kinds of models, and telling the story as strongly as we can. But I think a watch out is, and Esme, you talk about this with your school, is you can create the governance and the legal structure, but is it a road to nowhere with funding? I think it's a really important thing, is we still need to work with the structures that are available. And so, yeah, there's a mix of idealism and kind of pragmatism about how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said, that as founders, your mission, the reason why you're here is to serve your mission, and what's the best way that you're able to do that. You mentioned funding a lot, you know, as lots of us know that and as you say, the funding isn't quite there yet for all of these models, but it is possible. And there are practitioners and people like we've got Oni Power today, who's written an absolutely brilliant book called Adventure Finance. I'd recommend everyone getting a copy. There are examples of people that have raised alternative funding, and Emma is a brilliant example. We had a lot of questions from the audience around funding. Specifically, one of the really interesting questions was, how did you manage to actually get investors on board with your particular model?
Through lots of trial and error. And working from, okay, so we have this legal structure which is for purpose. What does that look like when you create an investment agreement? And again, Patrick worked with us over that. The first investment round we did was 500,000. More recently, we've raised 1 million in a separate round. To then say, well, what rights should investors have? They can't vote, they can't control the company, but they should have some kind of say over elements of, particularly the financial side of the company. And what's the right balance with that? And so I guess the primary message that we have is, we're not going to maximize your money, because that's at odds with us having a regenerative kind of business model, where we also want to reward our team and our suppliers and our wider stakeholders. We want to have a fair exchange. We talk about fair exchange in our employment contracts, in our partner agreements. And so what's the fair exchange for an investor? And we talk about a fair return. And so, yeah, it's something which is a really live topic. And so looking to the kind of Purpose Foundation network in Germany, they use a more of a capped return. So your return as an investor can't keep growing. We tried that to start with, and actually we found that talking about a minimum was more helpful for us. So at what point would you be happy that you've got enough of a return on your investment? What is that minimum threshold? And is that the same for everyone? And then, yeah, I guess exactly how we brought on 275 individual investors is a really long story. But the headline is, they're predominantly individuals. And so they're not an institution that's constrained by its own statutory setup and T's and C's. And that we haven't been able to knock that door down yet. We keep trying.
Yeah, but you've done an incredible job. And if anyone wants to know more specifically around how Emma and her founders raised funding, she's got a brilliant Medium article that gives you all the details. It's a really interesting read. All right, so please keep your questions coming. I could ask them all day, but don't give me that monopoly. So we had lots of questions around what's the difference between some of these sort of ownership models, and I know that Patrick mentioned a couple of them, but it would be great to hear Patrick, and perhaps Deb also wants to jump in here around what's the difference between specifically the employee owned and the steward ownership model.
Yeah, the sort of a philosophical conceptual difference, I suppose, and I'm not quite sure why, as I said, why Yvonne Shu and I chose the sort of the in a way the ultimate benefit of the company is the planet, when he could have chosen the employees or some of the employees, and that's quite common. I think conceptually, the employee ownership, and that can be an employee ownership, could be a law firm that's owned by 5 partners, so they all own it. The employees too. That's an old model. A partnership model is an old model. For a large company, often the question is, well, how do you make that ownership meaningful? Is one of the questions, because if you've got 10,000 employees, the John Lewis Partnership has about, I think, 80,000 employees. So they have a whole intricate governance mechanism to make sure the wishes of the collective is expressed into the governance of the organization. So there's a lot of attention paid to that in employee ownership, because because you'll be able to see there's quick feedback loops. If an employee co-owner doesn't feel they're getting their views are expressed, then they're going to make a fuss, and the business won't work fundamentally. I think the steward ownership, I would see at its best, the typical model for employee ownership would be a steward ownership model too. There's trustees who steward the organization while it's owned on behalf of the employees. So that's the way I see it. Others may have a different take on it. Technically, the Purpose Foundation is a bit more limited. They say we don't distribute. Once you get to a certain size, you reward the founders, and then there's no more dividends paid out, and every penny is reinvested in the business. And it's central that control is held by the people working in the business. So it's a type of employee ownership, but it's the purpose which owns, not the employees or anybody, if that makes sense. So in a way, some models are extractive. Bosch, a charity owns, takes money out and doles it out to good causes. Some models are more, well, no, the mission is what owns, and some the employees own and they can get. So as I said, I hope that's helpful, because there's a whole load of variations and different flavors, I suppose, and it's connected to governance too.
I've probably got a few views on this as well. Thank you for the invitation to the session. So it's really interesting, because I suspect it's not a binary answer here. Employee ownership, when I think about it, really, it's the rise of employee ownership over the last 10 years has been from existing businesses that are looking to manage their futures. So, business owners who've established businesses, probably not established them with a clear purpose other than to make money. So these are family-owned businesses, second generation, first generation. Somebody had an idea to solve a problem. They've created a business, a limited company. They own the shares. They've had all the voting rights. They or their immediate families or a small group of shareholders. And now they're thinking about long-term succession and sustainability of that business after their involvement in it. And that has been the great driver of employee ownership, notwithstanding Patrick's example of the John Lewis Partnership. And there are others like Arup and Mott MacDonald and others. I think the interesting differentiation now is founding businesses like Library of Things, where their problem solving is motivated by the planet and not necessarily by profit, first and foremost. And I guess so therefore for me, it's not a binary thing. It's not about why you're doing something. It's about how you do it and what you do with the proceeds of the results of that. And, I may tomorrow come up with a fantastic idea, which isn't actually going to directly do anything to save the planet, but is going to solve a really fundamental problem that people have in their lives. but it's how I go about doing that, the supply chains I use, what I do with the proceeds of the money that I make, how I distribute my wealth, the profits, etc., which will define whether or not I am doing that in a responsible way. And therefore, it's likely that I might incorporate a few different elements. I might have a bit of employee ownership, because I think it's really important to give employees the agency and the sense of ownership and responsibility that they need to do the best job they can. And, you know, motivating people with financial returns is not a nasty thing to do. You know, it's a positive thing to do if it's in the context of, it's also about having a voice. It's not just having a stake, it's having a say as well. But I might want that to be, say, a B Corp organisation that's very embedded with purpose and, you know, at the heart of its articles. And, you know, yesterday or the day before, I was at the EOA conference and we had a session on donor economics, Patrick, which was, you know, of course, you know, I'm a huge fan of Kate Raworth and everything that she's doing. So to me, you know, the world increasingly becomes more binary, doesn't it? It's got to be in or out, left or right, up or down, blue or red, you know. And in the case of employee ownership, I've had people say to me so many times, oh, well, it's just a different form of capitalism, isn't it? As if it's a criticism. Or for some people on the right, oh, it's just a form of socialism, as if that's a negative thing. And I've always said, actually, it's about socializing capital. So it takes the best of what makes a business work, which is you have to at some level generate some wealth in that business, or the business will fail. Whether it's whatever its ownership structure is, you have to create some wealth, even if it's to maintain the status quo. It's what you do in the process of creating that wealth and what you do with that wealth that actually defines your purpose. And so I think there isn't just one model. That's why I was so fascinated with the Patagonia model, because it clearly is a hugely important step they've taken. And it's yet part of the smorgasbord of different emerging ownership models, which I think will come to define the next generation of businesses.
Yeah, absolutely love that. It's such a good one to end on there, Deb. Absolutely. I think it's so, you know, I think that's why the Patagonia example is so interesting, because it has brought so much attention to this space. But I think what you mentioned, Deb, is that it's so important to think about, you know, what you want to do as a business, like what your focus is, how you're going to make it responsible, how you're going to continue your mission and your vision, whichever way it is, whatever way it works. And like specifically, how will you enable that to happen? And what Emma was saying is that there are, you know, we've got legal and governance restrictions here, but actually there's a huge amount of creativity within that you can explore. It might take some time. It's going to cost some money, definitely, to get brilliant lawyers like Patrick involved, but it's worth it. And you can, you know, take elements of different things and make the thing you want to create. Which I think is really amazing. We did have a question from Sophie, which I think is a really useful one, and I'd love to actually crowdsource some resources here. But maybe we'll start with Emma and Patrick around what resources are there to be able to explore alternative ownership models. Like, are there any templates, things like that around to help people get started with this?
Well, briefly, well, I suppose just if I may, just picking up a point that Deb made really nicely, I thought, was in a way what I see is what I'm hoping for, seeing emerge as a shift from this sort of binary, what is either communism or capitalism, is actually the sort of both and. I suppose increasingly I less get involved in only looking at ownership, or I've got a colleague, Sarah, who's on the call, where we look at a whole system approach and come into an organization. What's your context? What's your mission? And then we can say, well, actually your priority is not ownership now, it's the leadership, or it's the, you know, implementing self-management, and everything's related, you find, in a system, which is so annoying. And I suppose that brings me to the templates, is that, you know, I'd like to think we're still, I mean, Emma and I have had these conversations about, could we bring up templates? And you can go on Companies House and find that you won't get the investment agreement, you'll get the Articles of Association of Library of Things and B Corps and so on. So there's that, that's public information. Because they're so different, and I always hate saying this because as a lawyer, you know, as a practice, I think, oh, it means people have got to pay me. I think there is a lot to learn, and actually the Purpose Foundation has some interesting templates. Look at the Share Tribe investment agreement, and that's quite interesting, for example. And I see Orny shared something too. So there aren't yet, but I think I'm hoping in the next year or two we'll see more of those emerge, I think, and then people can start saying, well, I want it a bit like that, and then someone can tweak it rather than starting from scratch would be wasteful.
Yeah, I'd add to that too. I would love to see it a central bank of these kinds of agreements, because I sort of, back to my point earlier, is the work to create the agreement. So whether it was our Articles of Association and our Constitution or our investment agreement, Patrick took us through essentially like embodying those different stakeholders, and there's role play, and there's kind of a mix of your following your gut and what feels right, and then following your head to write that down. And it was more important for us to do the process of that as a co-founding team, so that we were striking that right balance around the terms that we wanted to set and the dynamics we wanted to create and how we wanted to make decision making. So it is actually very personal to you and your organization. And so the template is a really useful starting point, but there's also kind of work to do around the practice of that. And then once you've got your investment agreement or your Articles of Association, they're not static in a way. It's then a practice. You are then running the organization and convening your investors, your other stakeholders. And so we're constantly learning that. And so just to give you one example, we started hosting what we called open board night. And so we have the co-founding team, we have the wider team in Library of Things. We were bringing on these investors, and then we have our guardian, the Things Trust, that has its own members who are representing our wider stakeholders around the planet and the community and our borrowers. That's fine when it's written down, but really the meaning came from convening spaces where we could have dialogue, and where we as a co-founding team and as a wider team could bring our challenges and our opportunities and say, this is what's going on, advise us, like from your perspective, how would this impact you as a local partner, as a borrower? What is the impact of that on the planet? What about the investors? And we're always, our model is really about balance, so that we're serving our collection of stakeholders and not one set of stakeholders, in a traditional world, just serving your shareholders. So templates, yes, we've got to do that. That's like basic groundwork. And then I think the practice of how that applies to you, and then from the beginning and then ongoing, it's difficult to make that a kind of just a download and crack on kind of model.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think a really useful one is to hear examples of people that have done it. That's why Patagonia is so great, because it's an example of a big company that has done it rather than lots of small companies. But I wonder, in the last few minutes, Patrick, could you maybe go through some examples of some large companies that perhaps you've worked with or that have used some of these ownership models?
Oh, I mean, there are quite a few, particularly on the continents. I mean, the Purpose Foundation lists some examples of companies where they've done a Patagonia type thing. There's, I think the world's biggest insulin manufacturer is mainly owned by a charity, for example. It's a Danish company, Novo Nordisk, I think they're called. I mentioned Bosch and Bertelsmann. So sort of charities owning organizations is not uncommon in the continent. I think, and then there are the employee-owned companies which often have trustees which act like stewards, if you like. I think I've tended to work, because this work, in a way, what Emma was talking about was power structures, right? We're in a world where if you try to do something different, you're fighting against power structures, which means people become blind to what we think is we can see and say. So it is a difficulty. I've worked with. I mean, and the reality is actually, if you won't go with the big companies, they're also creative about ownership. I work for one of the biggest retailers in Europe. When we went to a new country, we do a joint venture, we do a partnership. So the idea of partnering with is not uncommon, and sacrificing and sharing and so collaborating. And I think that's part of the shift. But obviously the end goal was we're going to control. So a lot of my work in the last few years has been more with, creative entrepreneurs like a hydrogen car company at River Simple, where we have the governance structure is the ownership structure is the stakeholders all have a stake, the community, staff, investors, and the planet. And that's been, and they've, so they're a hydrogen car company, so but they're much smaller. They've got 30 staff, so they're much smaller. So big companies, it's much less easy to see because they've got the dictates of their owners, the stock market. And once you give away power to investors, it's very hard to get it back.
Yeah, I think that's a big one as well. Once you give power to investors, I think what would be, we had some more questions about investors, and I'd love to hear from you, Emma, around how you think we could involve investors more into these ownership models. I think this was a question from Oni, so if she wants to jump in as well.
How can we involve them? Yeah. So I think storytelling is a big thing. I think when we first started our fundraising 3 years ago, a lot has changed since then. So there was very limited kind of instruments available, especially in the social investment space where we started. Really, we were pointed to the grant team or the debt team, where they would say, you can borrow that amount of money, but you're going to pay us back 3 times or 8 times over the next 8 years. And we experimented with kind of a revenue linked instrument at that time, and there was really very little appetite. That's changed. So I think the kind of soft pressure on entrepreneur-led funding, saying this is our business, we know it best, this is the kind of funding that we want, this is what we think we can repay, who's going to invest that? It's kind of it's like pitching to the investor rather this is what we want, as opposed to just following their processes. We've had most success with networks where there's family offices, smaller trusts, and individuals who are, they have more independence around their money. So they're not tied up, as I said before, in like their own T's and C's. And I think leveraging that network. So we, as I said, we have 275 individuals now, ranging from 1 share through to many. Getting them to tell that story, getting them to really kind of fight your corner and say, this is a different way of doing it. I think what needs to change is in the institutional space, the way funds are designed. So fund managers, in a way, being introduced to these kinds of models and understanding that they can still make some money on that, and the business is much more likely to succeed without kind of really unreasonable pressures on it. So I don't know, storytelling, campaigning, presenting the solution, presenting that instrument that you really want. And then really, I think the network effect of many people doing that will mean that as it has done in the last few years, like it will continue to become more accessible for different kinds of ownership and investment structures to spread. It's a bit of like naive hopefulness there, maybe, but I think it is changing. The narrative has really changed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely changing. And you are an example of that is changing. All right, so we are almost at time. So thank you so much for everyone that showed up today and asked questions and engaged. I know that we've had a bit of a wide-ranging conversation today, around Patagonia. What have they done? What does that mean? What are the pros and cons of that model? But I think it's not necessarily about that. It's about really opening up the conversation to be like, there are other options. This is the future of business. I believe there are other options. It's really thinking about actually going backwards and what do you want? Who are you trying to serve? Who should have ownership? Who should have power? And designing something within the restrictions of your particular jurisdiction about what's possible. And then, involving credible lawyers, involving credible investors into that conversation, but feeling empowered to be able to do so. And I want you to ground yourselves in some kind of commitment today around what you want to do next. So is it like, actually, you know what, ownership, this is too much for me right now, but I'm going to look at it in 6 months? Is it like, I'm going to have a deep dive into all of these incredible examples of businesses that have done this? What's your commitment today? Please don't rush off to your next call, but take a few minutes if you can to really think about this. And I'll be sending a follow-up email with all the wonderful resources that people mentioned, and all the articles. So you've got somewhere to start as you launch your research into this area. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I hope to see you around. And thank you to the panelists. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, David. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Bye-bye.